Welcome to Unbound, the podcast with Beth Curry, author, storyteller, and survivor. This is where books meet real life, where Beth reads chapters from her work and breaks free from the traditional audiobook format, diving deeper into the personal experiences, lessons, and liberation behind every page. Nothing is off limits. Let's get unbound.
Hey everybody, welcome to an off-script episode of Unbound. I'm Beth. Hi. Before we get into today's episode, I want to tell you what inspired it. So recently I've been having conversations with three people, trauma survivors, all of them, in varying forms. You know, they haven't shared their stories publicly yet. They're not ready to come forward. Maybe they don't have any particular reason to, but hopefully they will someday, and maybe we'll be able to tackle that in a future episode together. I don't know. Anyway, one is a man who's worked in law enforcement for 35 years. Another is a woman who's been a paramedic for 12 years. And the third is another writer like me. And what struck me in talking with them is that we all share the same fear. That being good at our jobs, being functional, being articulate about what we've been through somehow makes us less believable. That our competence is evidence against us or something. So this episode's for them and for anyone else who's ever worried that surviving well means that people won't believe you struggled at all. And, I've got season 3 coming up, and I absolutely do have concerns about this. I've had recent conversations with family members too. That have me kind of pause for a moment, with things that they've said. And I think it's pretty fucked up, that the very thing that saved me, my ability to process what happened, to make sense of chaos and to turn pain into something kind of coherent, is the same thing that makes people doubt whether any of it was real. And that's troubling to me. I don't know. I'm a writer, I'm good with words, and I can take the messiest, most traumatic experiences and find the through line. I can articulate, what happened to me in ways that make sense, that have narrative and structure now, and maybe in ways that land emotionally. And apparently that makes me suspicious. And it's kind of sad. My trauma wasn't 3 months ago. It was over 3 decades ago. So, maybe 3 decades ago, I couldn't have possibly done what I've done over the last several years, trying to put my story together in a coherent way. But I've learned that people expect trauma to look a certain way. They expect you to be broken and incoherent and unable to function. And if you're not, if you've done the work and if you've healed, if you can actually talk about what happened without falling apart, and I guarantee you I'm probably going to fall apart when I do share my story, then maybe it wasn't that bad, or maybe you're exaggerating, or maybe you're just creative. Maybe you made the whole thing up. This is the cruel irony I'm living with right now as I prepare to release The Other Side of Quiet. The skills that I developed to survive, my ability to make sense of things and articulate experiences clearly, to find meaning in the meaningless. These now make me doubt my own credibility. My competence has kind of become evidence against me in my own mind too, right? And I'm not alone in this. This is something that so many trauma survivors face, and we don't talk about it enough, at least with other people. We talk about it to each other, but not with other people. And that's kind of what I'm here to do today. So there's an impossible position that trauma survivors are put in. Psychologists call this the credibility paradox. If you can't articulate what happened to you, like if you're too upset or too triggered or too fragmented, you're not credible. You're too emotional. You're not making sense. You need to calm down before anyone can take you seriously. But if you can articulate it, and if you've done therapy, and if you've processed it, if you can tell your own story without breaking down, then clearly it wasn't that bad, and you're fine and you've moved on. So why are you still talking about it? It's a trap. It's like this double bind. You can't win. People are going to pick your shit apart no matter what. Too broken? Not credible. Too functional? You must not have been that broken to begin with. And God forbid you're a writer. God forbid you have the ability to take your experience and shape it into something readable and something that flows and something that has a beginning and a middle and an end, because then you're just making up stories. That's what writers do, right? We make things up. Never mind that the story is true. Never mind that every word of it happened. Never mind that the reason I can tell it well now is because I've spent years doing the brutal work of making sense of senseless things. And it's really messed up. Research in trauma psychology shows that developing a coherent narrative is actually a sign of successful trauma processing. It's what therapists want you to achieve over time. It's evidence that you've done the work and that you've integrated the experience and that you're healing. But the irony is that this marker of healing becomes suspect, right? The very thing that proves that you've processed your shit becomes evidence that maybe it wasn't real to begin with. The fact that I'm good at it, that's apparently proof I'm lying, at least to some people, right? Now, I've talked before about not being believed, about sharing something vulnerable during the pandemic, and having people I loved, people I thought loved me, call me a liar, mock me, dismiss my lived experience because it didn't fit their narrative of how things should be. That shit leaves a mark. It does. And here's what I'm realizing. This wasn't the first time I wasn't believed. That was just the most recent and the most public instance of a pattern that started when I was 5 years old. I pissed myself in kindergarten because my teacher wouldn't listen to me when I said I needed the bathroom. I told her. I used my words. I advocated for myself, and she didn't believe me or she didn't care. And I pissed myself in front of the whole class. And that was the first, lesson. Even when you tell the truth, even when your need is real, people might not believe you. Sunday school taught me the same thing. I asked questions, genuine, curious questions, and I got shut down a lot. My questions were problematic. My curiosity was inconvenient. The message was clear. Your thoughts and your experiences and your reality, they don't matter as much as keeping things comfortable for everybody else. So I learned, from a very young age to self-silence. I learned that speaking up more often than not made things worse. I learned that sometimes it's safer to just not say anything at all. And that self-silencing, that set me up for everything that came after. Unfortunately. The things that happened in my teen years that I couldn't talk about, and the patterns in my 20s and 30s where I made myself smaller and quieter and more palatable. I spent decades learning that my truth was too much, that it was too complicated, that it was too inconvenient and too unbelievable. Psychologists have a term for that too. What I'm experiencing now, it's anticipatory invalidation. So that's when survivors kind of pre-experience the dismissal they've learned to expect. And I'm essentially doing to myself what I fear others will do to me, questioning my own credibility before anyone else can. And now, now that I'm choosing to tell my story, I'm choosing to tell my story anyway. And I'm kind of terrified that the response will be the same. We don't believe you. So here's something I haven't talked about publicly. I know there are people in my life, people I still interact with, who have said things about me behind my back. I know this because it gets back to me, because people talk, word travels, just does. People love gossip. And these aren't strangers, these are friends or people who call themselves friends to my face while questioning my credibility behind my back. They'll say things like she's so dramatic or she's always got some story. I mean, she's a writer. Of course, she's going to make it sound worse than it was. Do you really believe all that? All these stupid comments. And, the thing that makes it so insidious to me, they never say it to my face. They drop these things with other people. Like, do you believe that? Or do you even think that's real or whatever? But they never say it to me. They're perfectly nice to my face, supportive even, encouraging. But I know they don't believe me. I know they think I'm exaggerating or attention-seeking or just being creative. And the fucked up part, I still have some of these people in my life. Because cutting out everyone who's ever doubted you is exhausting, believe me. Relationships are complicated, sometimes you choose your battles. But it means that I'm walking around knowing that when the other side of quiet comes out, these people are going to read it or hear it here. And they're going to have opinions and judgments and doubts. They're already taking some of the people and things that I've been through and talking about it behind my back to other people. This has been going on for years, years, but they won't talk to me about it. They're going to compare it to other things I've written and decide that because I'm good at writing, I must be good at making things up too. And this is the wild thing that you're going to find out about season 3. I was literally living 2 separate lives. One was an entire lie, and one was an entire truth. So there's this thing in psychology called the fundamental attribution error. When people see someone functioning well, they attribute it to internal factors like personality, character, maybe even dishonesty. They think, she's just dramatic or she's creative, so she's embellishing, whatever. What they don't see, what they refuse to consider are the external factors. Excuse me, the years of therapy, the decades of processing, the brutal, exhausting work it took to get from broken to functional. They see the end result and they assume that's who I've always been. They don't see the journey at all. And that hurts. It hurts to know that people who claim to care about me have already decided I'm not entirely trustworthy, that my truth is negotiable, that their interpretation of my life matters more than my actual lived experience. So here's where we are. I developed these skills, this ability to process, to articulate, to make sense of trauma as a survival mechanism. When your reality is being questioned, when your experiences are being minimized, when nobody's listening, you get really good at explaining yourself. You learn to be clear and coherent and maybe even compelling. You learn to tell your story in ways that might finally make someone understand. And I got good at it because I had to. Because the alternative was staying silent and invisible and stuck. And now, these skills are being used against me in my own mind and potentially by others. That whole bit, she's too articulate about her trauma, so she must not be that traumatized. She can write about it so clearly, so it must not have been that bad what she went through. She's too functional. Real trauma survivors can't just be okay. They can, by the way. Yeah, it's the competence trap, right? The better you get at surviving, the less people believe you struggled. And the more you heal, the more people question whether you were ever really hurt. And for someone like me, someone whose career is built on the ability to communicate and craft a narrative and find the right words, it's a special kind of hell. Yeah, because the thing that makes me good at what I do is the same thing that makes people doubt me. It's evidence against me, as I said. Psychologists have studied what they call trauma mythology. This is the cultural expectation that trauma survivors must remain visibly broken to be believed. That's not really how healing works. Healing is possible and recovery is real, and neither of those things negate what happened at all. So I'll explain why people struggle with this, because understanding the psychology helps me not take it so personally, most of the time anyway. So there's this concept called the just world hypothesis, and people need to believe, that the world is fundamentally fair and that bad things happen for a reason and people get what they deserve and suffering leaves permanent visible marks and all that jazz. And when someone functions well after trauma, it kind of threatens this belief. If you can experience something terrible and still be okay, then, maybe the world isn't as orderly as they need it to be, right? Like maybe bad things can happen to anyone, including them, and maybe suffering doesn't always show. And that's terrifying. So instead of expanding their understanding, they shrink yours, right? They decide maybe, it wasn't that bad, because if it was that bad and you're still okay, then their entire worldview has to shift. And to most people, they're not going to do that. They'll just dismiss your experience before they will question their own assumptions about how trauma works, right? And there's also cognitive dissonance at play as well. I talk about CD a lot. People struggle to hold two conflicting ideas at once. This person is competent and functional, and this person experienced severe trauma. These two things feel contradictory to someone, even though they're not, right? So rather than accept that they can both be true simultaneously, people dismiss one. And unfortunately, it's usually the trauma that gets dismissed. They'll keep the version of you that makes sense to them, the functional and articulate and capable one. And then they'll decide that the trauma must not have been as bad as you say, because otherwise, how could you possibly be doing so well? What they don't understand is that doing well doesn't mean wasn't hurt. It means did the work to heal. And I'm telling you this not just because it's my experience, but because I know I'm not alone. Like, how many people are staying silent right now because they're afraid of not being believed? How many people have processed their trauma, done the work, healed themselves, and feel they can't talk about what happened because they're too okay to be credible. How many people are trapped, between those two impossible options, be broken enough to be believed or functional enough to be dismissed? Like, this is how silence perpetuates itself. This is how people stay stuck. Not because they can't heal, but because healing makes them less believable, as I've said 100 times already. We've created this culture where trauma has to perform a certain way to be valid. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Where suffering has to look a certain way to be real. If you've done the work and you come out on the other side, people assume maybe it wasn't that deep of a hole to begin with, and that's bullshit. It's total bullshit. It frustrates the hell out of me. Healing doesn't erase what happened. Getting better at talking about it and sharing your experience doesn't make the experience less real. And being functional now doesn't mean you weren't completely dysfunctional before, because I assure you, I was. The work I've done to get here, to be able to talk about this clearly and write about it and process it without completely falling apart again, the work is evidence of how bad it was, not evidence that it wasn't. Right? If it had been easy, I wouldn't have needed to develop these skills. If it had been simple, I would have spent years in therapy learning how to make sense of it. And I feel like I did. I did, but not straight all in a row, but, cumulative. Anyway, if it had been no big deal, I wouldn't be here decades later still processing it. I need to get this out there because I want to be done with it, Something else people don't understand, this didn't come easy. None of it. You're going to see a coherent narrative, when you read a book that flows and hear a story that makes sense and think it was always that clear. People might think I just sat down and wrote it out start to finish because I'm a writer and that's what writers do, right? But that's not what happened at all. This process has taken decades, like literally decades of piecing things together, trying to make sense of fragments or filling in gaps that my brain has blocked out for literal survival. Because, that is what trauma does, right? It scatters and it, breaks your timeline into pieces and it hides things from you that were too painful to process in the moment. And it leaves you with, impressions and feelings for sure and snapshots and just these little snippets, but not always the full picture ever. I've had to go back and relive things I didn't want to remember. And I've reached out to other people, family members, old friends, and asked them to fill in details I'd forgotten about or blocked out entirely. And let me tell you, that was hell. Just having to ask someone else, hey, do you remember this thing that happened to me? Because I don't have the full story anymore. And, reliving the ways that I hurt people. That's really hard. Really hard. And I didn't take creative concessions with this. I couldn't. This isn't, fiction where I can fill in the blanks with whatever makes the story work better. This is my life. This was my life. And these are real events and real people and real consequences. So when something was fuzzy, I had to do the work to clarify it. I had to face things that I really would rather have left buried. And I had to sit with that discomfort of not remembering and the shame of needing help to reconstruct my own history where it could be reconstructed. I've lost a lot of people over the years too. So, there's gaps there that I just can't seem to fill. And holding that fear that maybe not having perfect recall means that people won't believe me. This is really hard, writing this, and it's going to be really hard sharing it. Every chapter and every story and every detail, I had to earn it. I had to go back into those experiences and sit with them until I could pull out the full truth, not the prettied up version, not the version that makes me look better or makes other people look worse, but the actual truth as close as I could get to it, with the help that I had. And it was brutal. It is brutal. Writing trauma isn't like writing fiction. With fiction, you can stop when it gets too hard. You can take a break and you can work on something else and come back when you're ready. But with this, I had to stay there. I had to keep going back into the pain, the confusion, the fear, the shame. I had to relive it in order to write it honestly. And my God, the nightmares that came out of this too. So when I worry that people will think I'm just being creative, when I fear that they'll just dismiss it as exaggeration or pure storytelling, it makes me want to scream because this wasn't creative. It's a wild story. I know that. I lived it. It is. But it's my truth. It's the truth. It was archaeological. It was excavation. And this was years of digging through debris to find what was true and real in mine. Um, and it reads coherently now. It's not because it was always clear. It's because I've spent years making it clear and relearning. Like, I, even as recent as 15 or 20 years ago, had a belief about my teenage years that I've had to completely relearn, reframe, and relabel as something else because that's what it was. So, like, that's another wild thing to me. It'll make more sense, when I share. But yeah, like decades of therapy and decades of conversations and decades of thoughts and memories and sitting with the uncomfortable truth of my own life, my younger years, until I could finally put words to it. It's not creative license. It's the opposite. It's the hardest fucking work I've ever done. Psychological irony in it, there's something called imposter syndrome, and I've talked about that before, maybe not on the show, but definitely on social media. It usually applies to professional achievement, this feeling that you don't deserve your success, that you're a fraud, that you'll be found out or something. I've experienced this a lot, when I have a success, if I win an award or get some sort of acknowledgement somewhere, I'm like, what? It's weird. Like, it just doesn't feel right for me, but for trauma survivors, it works differently. It's not that I feel like a fraud about my accomplishments. It's that I feel like a fraud about my own, like, pain, right? Like, maybe I'm not traumatized enough to claim this identity. And maybe because I can function and because I can articulate it, because I've healed, maybe it wasn't real to begin with. Like, it's just such a mind fuck. And this is what decades of invalidation does to you. You start doing it to yourself. So what do I do with this, with the knowledge that people might not believe me, with the fear that my competence will be used against me? I'm going to tell my story anyway. Deal with it. Because what I keep coming back to is the people who need to hear it, the people who are struggling with the same fear and the same doubt and the same am I believable spiral, these people will know it's true because they'll recognize themselves in it. They won't question it because they've lived it. They will know. And the people who don't believe me, or the people who think I'm exaggerating or making it up or being dramatic or talking about me behind my back and not talking with me, these people were never going to support me anyway. And their disbelief says everything about them and absolutely nothing about me. Liars don't lie awake at night worrying about credibility. People who make things up don't agonize over whether they'll be believed. They don't second guess themselves and they don't feel this fear at all. The fact that I'm worried about this is actually evidence of my integrity. The fear itself proves I'm telling the truth. And I have to just trust that. I have to trust that my truth is valid, whether or not everyone believes it. I have to trust that being good at communicating doesn't make me a liar. It makes me a good witness to my own life. And that's it. Like, it's that simple. I'm done, I'm done making myself smaller to make other people more comfortable. It's all going to make sense in season 3, I'm telling you. I'm done. I'm done staying quiet to avoid judgment. I'm done pretending my trauma wasn't that bad just because I survived it well. Initially, I did not survive it well. You'll see. The other side of quiet is going to tell my story. All of it. The messy parts, the complicated parts, the parts that some people won't want to hear. And I'm going to tell it clearly and articulately, competently, because that's what I do. That's a skill I developed to survive, and I refuse to be ashamed of that. If people want to use my competence against me, that's their problem. I know my truth. I know what happened. People who are with me know what happened. And I know that the right people, the people who truly matter, will believe me. The law enforcement officer I mentioned at the beginning, he spent 35 years being the person everyone else relied on in crisis. Strong, capable, unshakable. And he's terrified that if he tells his story, people will say, but you were fine. You did your job. How bad could it have been? And the paramedic, 12 years of saving lives, staying calm under pressure, being the competent professional in the room, and she's afraid that her competence will be used as evidence that she couldn't have ever been suffering. And the other writer, she's afraid of the same thing I am. Being good with words will make people think she's just good at making things up. We are all trapped in this same paradox. The skills that saved us are the skills that make us doubt ourselves, but we're telling our stories anyway. And I hope those 3 will too. Silence has not protected us. Staying small hasn't kept any of us safe, and pretending we're fine when we're not hasn't made anyone believe us more. So Yeah, if you're someone who's afraid to tell your story because you're too functional now, because you've healed too well, or because you're afraid people will think you're exaggerating, I see you. I believe you, and I'm here to tell you that your healing doesn't invalidate your pain. The fact that you survived doesn't mean it wasn't hard. The fact that you can talk about it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And the fact that you're okay now doesn't mean you were always okay. I know. Tell your story anyway. The people who need to hear it will believe you, and the people who don't, they were never your people to begin with. Thanks for listening. If you're looking for any info about the show, everything's in the show notes. Please follow the Facebook group for discussion, and I will see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Unbound with Beth Curry. Join the conversation in the Facebook group or visit author.bethcurry.com. Want to support the show? Head to ko-fi.com/unbound podcast. Until next time, stay unbound.